The War of the Worlds 2. Part of 3_parts, Chapter_13. How one fell curate after getting this sudden lesson in the power of one Testria 1 weapons. The Martians retreated to their original upon Horsell Common, and in their haste, and encumbered with the debris of their smashed companion, they no doubt overlooked many such a stray and negligible victim as myself had they left their comrade and pushed on forthwith. There was nothing at that time between them and London but batteries of 12-pounder guns, and they would certainly have reached the capital in advance of the tidings of their approach, as dreadful and destimate their advent would have been as the earthquake that destroyed Lisbon a century ago. But they were in no hurry. Cylinder followed cylinder on its interplanetary flight. Every 24 hours brought them reinforcement. And meanwhile the military and naval authorities, now ally to the tremendous power of their antagonists, worked with furious energy. Every minute a fresh gun came into position until, before twilight, every copse, every row of suburban villas on the hilly slopes Kingston and Richmond, masked an expectant black muzzle. And through the chaffed and desolate area perhaps 20 square miles altogether that encircled the Martian encampment on Horsell Common, through charred and ruined villages among the green trees, through the blackened and smoking arcades that had but a day ago PME spinneys, crawled the devoted scouts with the heliographs that were presently to warn the gunners of the Martian approach. But the Martians now understood our command of artillery and the danger of human proximity, and not a man ventured within a mile of either cylinder, save at the price of his life. It would seem that these giants spent the earlier part of afternoon in gump to and fro, transferring everything from the second and third cylinders, the second in Addlestone Golf Links and the third at Pireford, to their original pit on Horsell Common. Over that, the blackened heather and mined buildings that stretched and stood one as sentinel, while the rest abandoned their vast fighting machines and descended into the pit. They were hard at work there far into the night, and the towering pillar of dense green smoke that rose therefrom could be seen from the hills about Merrow, and even, it is said, from Banstead and Epsom Downs. And while the Martians were thus preparing for their next sally, and in front of humanity gathered for the battle, I made my way with infinite pains and from the fire and smoke of burning Weybridge towards London. I saw an abandoned very small and remote, drifting downstream, and throwing off the most of my sodden clothes, I went after it, gained it, and so escaped out of that destruction. There were no oars in the boat, but I contrived to paddle, as well as my parboiled hands would allow, down the river towards Holyford and Walton, going very tediously and continually looking me, as you may well understand. I followed the Tyler, because I considered that the water gave me my best chance of escape should these giants return. The hot water from the Martians' overthrow drifted downstream with me, so that for the best part of a mile I could see little of either bank. Once, however, I made out a string of black figures hurrying across the meadows from the direction of Weybridge. Holyford, it seemed, was deserted, and several of the houses facing the river were on fire. It was strange to see the place quite tranquil, quite desolate under the hot blue sky, the smoke and little threads of flame going straight up into the heat of the afternoon. Never before had I seen houses burning without the accompaniment of an obstructive crowd. A little farther on the dry reeds up the bank were smoking and glowing, and a line of fire inland was marching steadily across a late field of hay. For a long time I drifted, so painful and weary was I after the violence I had run through, and so intense the heat upon the water. Then my fears got the better of me again, and I resumed my paddling. The sun scorched my bare back. At last, as the bridge at Walton was coming into sight round the bend, my fever and faintness overcame my fears, and I landed on the Middlesex bank and lay down, deadly sick, amid the long grass. I suppose the time was then 4 or 5 o'clock. I got up presently, walked perhaps half a mile without meeting a soul, and then lay down again in the shadow of a hedge. I seem to remember talking, wonderingly, to myself during that last spurt. I was also very thirsty, and bitterly regretful I had drunk no more water. It is a curious thing that I felt angry with my wife. I cannot account for it, but my impotent desire to reach Leatherhead wold-eyed me excessively. I do not clearly remember the arrival of Curate, so that probably I dozed. I became aware of him as a seated figure in soot-smudged shirt sleeves, and with his upturned, clean-shaven face staring at a faint flickering that danced over the sky. The sky was what is called a mackerel sky, rows and rows of faint down plumes of cloud, just tinted with the midsummer sunset. I sat up, and at the rustle of my motion he looked at me quickly. "Have you any water?" I asked abruptly. He shook his head. "You have been asking for water for the last hour," he said. For a moment we were silent, taking stock of each other. I dare say he found me a strange enough figure, naked, save for my water-soaked trousers and socks, scalded, and my face and shoulders blackened by the smoke. His was a fair weakness, his chin retreated, and his hair lay in crisp, almost flaxen curls on his low forehead. His eyes were rather large, pale blue, and blankly staring. He spoke abruptly, looking vacantly away from me. "What does it mean?" he said. "% do these things mean?" I stared at him and made no elsewhere _ he extended a thin white hand and spoke in almost a complaining tone. % why are these things permitted? Lat sins have we done? The morning service was over, I was walking through the roads to clear my brain for the afternoon, and then fire, earthquake, death. As if it were Sodom and Gomorrah. All our work undone, all the work. What are these Martians? What are we? I answered, clearing my throat. He his knees and tumped to look at me again. For half a minute, perhaps, he stared silently. "I was walking through the roads to clear my brain," he said. And suddenly, fire, earthquake, death. He relapsed into silence, with his chin now sunken almost to his knees. Presently he began waving his hand. "All the work, all the Sunday schools, what have we done? What has Weybridge done? Everything gone, everything destroyed. The church. We rebuilt it only 3 years ago _ gone. Swept out of existence. Why?" Another pause, and he broke out again like one demented. "The smoke of her burned goeth up forever and ever," he shouted. His eyes flamed, and he pointed a lean finger in the direction of Weybridge _ by this time I was beginning to take his measure. The tremendous tragedy in which he had been involved, it was evident he was a fugitive from Weybridge, had driven him to the very verge of his reason. "Are we far from Sunbury?" I said, in a matter-of-fact tone. "Hat are we to do?" he asked. "Are these creatures everywhere? Has the earth been given over to them? Are we far from Sunbury?" "Only this morning I officiated at early celebration. Things hail changed," I said, quietly. "You must keep your head. There is still hope." "Horror." "Yes. Plentiful horror for all this destruction." I began to explain my view of our position. He listened at first, but as I went on the interest dampening in his eyes gave place to their former stare, and his regard wandered from me. "THLS must be the beginning of the end," he said, interrupting me. "The end. The great and terrible day of the Lord. When men shall call upon the mountains and the rocks to fall upon them and hide them from the face of him that sitteth upon the throne." I began to understand the position. I ceased my reasoning, struggled to my feet, and, standing over him, laid my hand on his shoulder. "Be a man," said I. "You are scared out of your wits. What good is religion if it collapses under calamity? Think of what earthquakes and floods, wars and volcanoes, have done before to men. Did you think God had exempted Weybridge? He is not an insurance agent." For a time he sat in blank silence. "But how can we escape?" he asked, suddenly. "They are invulnerable, they are pitiless." "Neither the one nor, perhaps, the other," I answered. "And the mightier they are the more sane and wary should we. One of them was killed yonder not 3 hours ago." "Killed?" he said, staring. "How can God's ministers be killed?" I saw it happen. Proceeded to tell him we have chanced to come in for the thick of it, said I, and that is all. What is that flicker in the sky? He asked abruptly. I told him it was the heliograph signaling that it was the sign of human help and effort in the sky. We are in the midst of it, I said, quiet as it is. That flicker in the sky tells of the gathering storm yonder. I take it are the Martians, and Londonward, where those hills rise about Richmond and Kingston and the trees give cover, earthworks are being thrown up and guns are being placed. Presently the Manians will be coming this way again, and even as I spoke he sprang to his feet and stopped me by a gesture. Listen, he said. From beyond the low hills across the water came the dull resonance of distant guns and a remote weird crying. Then everything was still. A cockchafer came droning over the hedge and past us. High in the west the crescent moon hung faint and pale above the smoke of Ivy Bridge and Shepperton and the hot, still splendor of the sunset. We had better follow this path, I said, northward. Chapter _14 In London. My younger brother was in London when the Martians fell at Woking. He was a medical student working for an imminent examination, and he heard nothing of arrival until Saturday morning. The Monk papers on Saturday contained, in addition to lengthy special articles on the planet Mars, on life in the planets, and so forth, a brief and vaguely worded telegram, all the more striking for its brevity. The Martians, alarmed by the approach of a crowd, had killed her with a quick-firing gun, so the story ran. The telegram concluded with the words, formidable as they seem to be, the Martians have not moved from the pit into which they have and, indeed, seem incapable of doing so. Probably this is due to the relative strength of the Earth's gravitational energy. On that last text their leader writer expanded very comfortingly. Of course all the students in the Crammers biology class, to Ivik my brother went that day, were intensely interested, but there were no signs of any unusual excitement in the streets. The afternoon papers puffed scraps of news under big headlines. They had nothing to tell beyond the movements of troops about the Cornrunnon, and the burning of pine woods between Woking and Weybridge, until 8. Then the St. James's Gazette, in an extra special edition, announced the bare fact of the interruption of telegraphic communication. This was thought to be due to the burning pine trees across the line. Nothing more of fighting was known that night. The night of my drive to Leatherhead and back my brother felt no anxiety about us, as he knew from the description in the papers that the cylinder was a good miles from my house. He made up his mind to run down that night to me, in order, as he says, to see the things they were killed. He dispatched a telegram, which never reached me, about 4 o'clock, and spent the evening at a music hall. In London, also, on Saturday night there was and my brother reached Waterloo in a cab. On the platform from which the midnight train usually starts he learned, after some waiting, that ATL accident prevented trains from reaching Woking that night. The nature of the accident he could not ascertain, indeed, the railway authorities did not clearly know at that time. There was very little excitement in the station, as the officials, failing to realize that anything farther than a breakdown between Byfleet and Woking Junction had occurred, were running the theatre trains which usually passed through Woking round by Virginia Water or Guildford. They were busy making the necessary arrangements to alter the route of the Southampton and Portsmouth Sunday League excursions. A nocturnal newspaper reporter, mistaking my brother for the Tramp manager, to whom he bears a slight resemblance, waylaid and tried to interview him. Few people, excepting the railway officials, connected the breakdown with the Manians. I read, in another account of these events, that on Sunday morning all London was electrified by the news from Woking. As a matter of there was nothing to justify that very extravagant phrase. Plenty of Londoners did not hear of the Manians until the panic of Monday morning. Those who did took some time to realize all that the hastily worded telegrams in the Sunday papers conveyed. The majority of people in London do not read Sunday papers. The habit of personal security, moreover, is so deeply fixed in the Londoner's mind, and startling intelligence so much a matter of course in the papers, that they could read without any personal tremors, About 7 o'clock last night the Manians came out off Cylinder, and, moving about under an armor of metallic shields, have completely wrecked Woking Station with the adjacent houses, and massacred an entire battalion of the Cardigan Regiment. No details are known. Maxims have absolutely useless against their armor, the field guns have been disabled by them. Flying hussars have iron galloping into Chertsey. The Martians appear to be moving slowly towards Chertsey or Windsor. Great anxiety prevails in West Surrey, and earthworks are being thrown up to check the advance. London would underscore that was how the Sunday Sun put it, and a clever and remarkably prompt handbook article in the Referee compared the affair to a menagerie suddenly let loose in a village. No one in London knew positively of the nature of the armoured Martians, and there was still a fixed idea that these monsters must be sluggish, crawling, creeping painfully. Such expressions occulted in almost all the earlier reports. None of the telegrams could have been written by an eyewitness of their advance. The Sunday papers printed separate editions as further news came to hand, some even default of it. But there was practically nothing more to tell until late in the afternoon, when the authorities gave the press agencies the news in their possession. It was stated that the people of Walton and Weybridge, and all the district were pouring along the roads Londonward, and that was all. My brother went to church at the Foundling Hospital in the Monk, still in ignorance of what had happened on the previous night. There he heard allusions made to the invasion, and a special prayer for peace. Coming out, he bought a Referee. He became alarmed at the news in this, and went again to Waterloo Station to find out if communication were restored. The omnibuses, carriages, cyclists, and innumerable people walking in their best clothes seemed scarcely affected by the strange intelligence that the newslenders were disseminating. People were interested, or, if alarmed, alarmed only on account of the local residents. At the station he heard for the first time that the Windsor and Chertsey lines were now interrupted. The porters told him that several remarkable telegrams had been in the morning from Byfleet and Chertsey stations, but that these had abruptly ceased. My brother could get very little precise detail out of them. "There's fighting going on about Weybridge," was the extent of their information. The train service was now very much disorganized. Quite a lot of people who had been expecting friends from places on the Southwestern network were standing about the station. One grey-headed old gentleman came and abused the Southwestern Company bitterly to my brother. "It wants showing up," he said. 1 or 2 trains came in from Richmond, Putney, and Kingston, containing people who had gone out for a day's boating and found the locks closed and a feeling of panic in the air. A man in a blue and white blazer addressed my brother, full of strange tidings. "There's hosts of Irapple driving into Kingston in traps and cans and things, with boxes of valuables and all that," he cycled. "They own from Molesey and Weybridge and Walton, and they say there's guns heard at Chertsey, heavy firing, and that mounted soldiers HAL 7E told them to get off at once because the Martians are coming. We heard guns firing at Hampton Cound Station, but we thought it was thunder. What the dickens does it all mean? The Martians can't get out of their pit, can they?" My brother could not tell him. Afterwards he found that the vague feeling of alarm had spread to the clients of the Underground Railway, and that the Sunday excursionists began to return from all over the southwestern Lung, Bams, Wimbledon, Richmond Park, Kew, and so forth at unnaturally early hours, but not a soul had anything more than vague hearsay to tell of everyone connected with the terminus. Seemed 5 o'clock. The gathering crowd in the station was immensely excited by the opening off line of which is almost invariably closed, between the southeastern and the southwestern stations, and the passage of carriage trucks bearing huge guns and carriages crammed with soldiers. These were the guns that were brought up from Woolwich and Chatham to cover Kingston. There was an exchange of pleasantries. "You'll get eaten. We're the beast tamers," and so on. A little while after that a squad of police came into the station and began to clear the public off the platforms, and my brother went out into the street again. The church bells were ringing for evensong, and a squad of Salvation Army lasses came singing down Waterloo Road. On the bridge a number of loafers were watching a curious brown scum that came drifting down the stream in patches. The sun was just setting, and the clock tower and the houses of Parliament rose against one of most peaceful skies it is possible to imagine, a sky of gold, baffed with long transverse stripes of reddish-purple cloud. There was talk of a floating body. One of the men there, a reservist he said he was, told my brother he had seen the heliograph flickering in the west. In Wellington Street my brother met a couple of sturdy roughs who had just been rushed out of Fleet Street with still wet newspapers and staring placards. Dread L1 catastrophe, they bawled one to the other down Wellington Street. Fighting at Weybridge. Full description. Repulse of the Manians. London in danger. He had to give threepence for a copy of that paper. Then it was, and then only, that he realized something of the hill power and terror of these monsters. He learned that they were not merely a handful of small sluggish creatures, but that they were minds swaying vast mechanical, and that they could move swiftly and smite with such power that even the mightiest guns could not stand against them. They were as vast spider-like machines, nearly 100 feet high, capable of the speed of an express tram, and able to shoot out a beam of intense heat. Masked batteries, chiefly of field guns, had been planted in the country about Horsen Common, and especially between the Woking district and London till 5 of machines had been seen moving towards the Thames, and one, by a happy chance, had been destroyed. In the other cases the shells had missed, and the batteries had been at once annihilated by the heat rays. Heavy losses of soldiers were mentioned, but the tone of the dispatch was optimistic. The Martians had repulsed, they were not invulnerable. They had retreated to their triangle of cylinders again, in the circle Woking. Signallers' heliographs were pushing forward upon them from all sides. Guns were in rapid transit from Windsor, Portsmouth, Aldershot, Woolwich, even from the north, among others, long wire guns of 95 tons from Woolwich. Altogether 116 were in position or being hastily placed, chiefly covering London. Never before in England had there been such a vast or rapid concentration of military material. Any of the cylinders that and it was held, could be destroyed at once by high explosives, which were being rapidly manufactured and distributed. No doubt, ran the report, the situation was of the strangest and gravest description, but the public was exhorted to await and discourage panic. No doubt the Martians were strange and terrible in the extreme, but at the outside there could not be more than 20 of them against our millions. The authorities had reason to, from the size of the cylinders, that at the outside there could not be more than 5 in each cylinder, 15 altogether. And one at least was disposed of, perhaps more. The public would be fairly warned of the approach of danger, and great measures were being taken for the protection of the people in the threatened southwestern suburbs. And so, with reiterated assurances of safety of London and the ability of the authorities to cope with the difficulty, this quasi-proclamation closed. This was printed in enormous type on paper so fresh that it was still wet, and there had been no time to add a word of comment. It was curious, my brother said, to see how ruthlessly the usual contents of the paper had been hacked and taken out to give this place. All down Wellington Street people could I seen fluttering out the pink sheets and reading, and the Strand was suddenly noisy with the voices of an army of hawkers following these pioneers. Men came scrambling off buses to secure copies. Certainly this news excited people intensely, whatever their previous apathy. The shutters of a map shop in the Strand were being taken down, my brother said, and a man in his Sunday raiment, lemon yellow gloves even, was visible inside the window hastily fastening maps of Surrey to the glass. Going on along the Strand to Trafalgar Square, the paper in his hand, my brother saw some of the adjectives from West Surrey. There was a man with his wife and 2 boys and some articles of furniture in a cart such as greengrocers use. He was driving from the direction of Westminster Bridge, and close behind him came a hay wagon with 6 respectable-looking people in it, and some boxes and bundles. The faces of these people were haggard, and their entire appearance contrasted conspicuously with the Sabbath-best appearance of the people on the omnibuses. People in fashionable clothing peeped at them out of cabs. They at the square as if undecided which way to take, and finally turned eastward along the Strand. Some way behind these came a man in workday clothes, riding one of those old-fashioned tricycles with a small front wheel. He was dirty and white in the face. My brother turned down towards Victoria, and met her of such people. He had a vague idea that he might see something of me. He noticed an unusual number of police regulating the traffic. Some of the refugees were exchanging news with the people on the omnibuses. One was professing to have seen the Martians. Boilers on stilts, I tell you, striding along like most of them were excited and animated by their strange experience. Beyond Victoria the public houses were doing a lively trade these arrivals. At all the street corners groups of people were reading papers, talking excitedly, or staring at these unusual Sunday visitors. They seemed to increase as night drew on, until at last the roads, my brother said, were like Epsom High Street on a Derby day. My brother addressed several of these auditives and got unsatisfactory answers from most. None of them could tell him any news of Woking except one man, who assured him that Woking had been entirely destroyed on the previous night. I come from Byfleet, he said. Man on a bicycle came through the place in the early morning, and ran from door to door warning us to come away. Then came soldiers. We went out to look, and there were clouds of smoke to the south, nothing but smoke, and not a soul coming that way. Then we heard the guns at Chertsey, and folks coming from Weybridge. So I've locked up my house and come home. At the time there was a strong feeling in the streets that the authorities were to blame for their incapacity to off invaders without all this inconvenience. At 8 o'clock a noise of heavy firing was distinctly audible all over the south of London. My brother could not hear it for the traffic in the main thoroughfares, but by striking through the quiet back streets to the river he was able to distinguish it quite plainly. He walked from Westminster to his apartments near Regent's Park. He was now very anxious on my account, and disturbed at the evident magnitude of the trouble. His mind was inclined to none, even as mine had none on Saturday, on military details. He thought of all those silent, expectant guns, of the suddenly nomadic countryside. He tried to imagine mandilas on stilts 100 feet high. There were 1 or 2 cartloads of refugees passing along Oxford Street, and several in the Marylebone Road, but so slowly was the news spreading that Regent Street and Portland Place were full of their usual Sunday night promenaders, albeit they talked in groups, and along the edge of Regent's Park there were as many silent couples walking out together under the scattered gas lamps as ever there had been. The night was warm and still, and a little oppressive. The sound of guns continued intermittently, and after midnight there seemed to be sheet lightning in the south. He read and reread the paper, fearing the worst had happened to me. He was restless, and after supper prowled out again aimlessly. He returned and tried in vain to divert his attention to his examination notes. He went to bed a little after midnight, and was awakened from lurid dreams in the small hours of Monday by the sound of door knockers, feet rung in the street, distant drumming, and a clamor of bells. Red reflections danced on the ceiling. For a moment he lay astonished, wondering whether day had come or the HWRLD gone mad. Then he jumped out of bed and ran to the window. His room was an attic, and as he thrust his head out, up and down the street there were a dozen echoes to the noise of his window, and heads in every kind of night disarray appeared. Enquiries were being shouted. "They are coming," bawled a policeman, hammering at the Martians are coming, and hurried to the next door. The sound of drumming and came from the Albany Street Baltax, and every churchier shot was hard at work killing sleep with a vehement disorderly tocsin. There was a noise of doors opening, and window after window in the houses flashed from darkness into yellow illumination. Up the street came galloping a closed carriage, bursting abruptly into noise at the comer, rising to a clattering climax under the window, and dying away slowly in the distance. Close on the rear of this came a couple of cabs, the forerunners of a long procession of flying vehicles, going for the most part to Chalk Farm where the Northwestern special trains were loading up, instead of coming down the gradient into Euston. For a long time my brother stared out of the window in blank astonishment, watching the policemen hammering at after door, and delivering their incomprehensible message. Then the door him opened, and the man who lodged across the landing came in, dressed only in shin, trousers, and slippers, his braces loose his waist, his hair disordered from his pillow. "El% at the devil is it?" he asked. "A fire." "A devil of a row." They both craned their heads out of the window, straining to hear what the policemen were shouting. People were coming out of the side streets, and standing in groups at the corners talking. "El% at the devil is it all about?" said my brother's fellow lodger. My brother answered him vaguely and began to dress, running with each garment to the window in order to miss nothing of the growing excitement, and presently men selling unnaturally early newspapers came bawling into the street, "London in danger of suffocation. The Kingston and Richmond defences forced. Fear-all massacres in the Thames Valley." And all about him in the rooms below, in the houses on each side and across the road, and behind in the Park Teltaces and in the 100 other streets of that part of Marylebone, and the Westbourne Park district and St. Pancras, and Westwood and Nonwood in Kilburn and St. John's Wood and Hampstead, and Eastwood in Shoreditch and Highbury and Haggerston and Hoxton, and, indeed, through all the vastness of London from Ealing to East Ham, people were rubbing their eyes, and opening windows to stare out and ask aimless questions, dressing hastily as the first breath of the coming storm of fear blew through the streets. It was the Dow.N of the great panic. London, which had gone to bed on Sunday night oblivious and inert, was awakened, in the small hours of Monday morning, to a vivid sense of danger. Unable from his window to learn what was happening, my brother went down and out into the street, just as the sky between the parapets of the houses grew pearl with the early dawn. The flying on foot and in vehicles grew more numerous every moment. "Black smoke," he heard people crying, and again black smoke. The contagion of such a unanimous fear was inevitable. As my brother hesitated on the doorstep, he saw another newsender approaching, and got a paper. The man Evers run away with the rest, and selling his papers for a shilling each as he ran, a grotesque mingling of profit and panic. And from this paper my brother read that catastrophic dispatch of the Commander-in-Chief: "The Manians are able to discharge enormous clouds of a black and poisonous vapor by means of rockets. They have smothered our batteries, destroyed Richmond, Kingston, and Wimbledon, and are advancing slowly towards London, destroying everything on the way. It is impossible to stop them. There is no safety from the black smoke but in instant flight." That was all, but it was enough. The whole population of the great 6 million city was stirring, slipping, running. Presently it would be pouring en masse northward. "Black smoke," the voices cried. "Fire." The of the neighboring church made a jangling tumult. A cart carelessly driven smashed, amid shrieks and curses, against the water trough up the street. Sickly yellow lights went to and fro in the houses, and some of passing cabs flaunted unextinguished lamps. And overhead the dawn was growing brighter, clear and steady and calm. He heard footsteps running to and fro in the rooms, and up and down stairs behind him. His landlady came to the door, loosely wrapped in dressing gown and shawl. Her husband followed, ejaculating. As my brother began to realize the import of all these things, he turned hastily to his OU.N room, put all his available money, some £10 altogether, into his pockets, and went out again into the streets. Chapter_15 had happened in Surrey. It was while the curate had sat and talked so wildly to me under the hedge in the flat meadows near Halliford, and while my brother was watching the fugitives stream over Westminster Bridge, that the Martians had resumed the offensive. So far as one can ascertain from the conflicting accounts that have been put forth, the majority of them remained busied with preparations in the Horsell pit until 9 that night, hurrying on some operation that disengaged huge volumes of green smoke. But 3 certainly came out about 8 o'clock and, advancing slowly and cautiously, made their way through Byfleet and Pireford towards Ripley and Weybridge, and so came in sight of the expectant batteries against the setting sun. These Martians did not advance in a body, but in a line, each perhaps a mile and a half from his nearest fellow. They communicated with one another by means of siren-like howls, running up and down the scale from one note to another. It was this howling and firing of guns at Ripley and St. George's Hill that we had heard at Upper Holyford. The Ripley gunners, unseasoned artillery volunteers who ought never to have been placed in such a position, fired one wild, premature, ineffectual volley, and bolted on horse and foot through the deserted village, while the Martian, without using his heat ray, walked serenely over their guns, stepped gingerly among them, passed in front of them, and so came unexpectedly upon the guns in Painshill Park, which he destroyed. The St. George's Hill men, however, were at a lead or of a better metal. Hidden by a pine wood as they were, they seemed to have been quite unsuspected by the Martian nearest to them. They laid their guns as deliberately as if they had iron on parade, and fired at 1,000 yards range. The shells flashed all round him, and he was seen to advance a few paces, stagger, and go down. Everybody yelled together, and the guns were reloaded in frantic haste. The overthrown Martian set up a prolonged ululation, and immediately a second glittering giant, answering him, appeared over the trees to the south. It all seemed that a leg of the tripod had been smashed by one of the shells. The whole of the second volley flew wide of the Martian on the ground, and, simultaneously, his companions brought their heat rays to bear on the battery. The ammunition blew up, the pine trees, all the guns flashed into fire, and only one or two of men who were already running over the crest of hill escaped. After this it would seem that the three counselled together and halted, and the scouts who were watching them report that they remained absolutely stationary for the next half hour. The Martian who had been overthrown crawled tediously out of his hood, a small brown figure, oddly suggestive from that distance of Blight, and apparently engaged in the repair of his support. About 9 he had finished, for his cowl was then seen above the trees again. It was a few minutes past 9 that night when these three sentinels were joined by 4 other Martians, each carrying a thick black tube. A similar tube was handed to each of 3, and the 7 proceeded to distribute themselves at equal distances along a curved line between St. George's Hill, Weybridge, and the village of Send, southwest of Ripley. A dozen rockets sprang out of the hills before them so as they began to move, and warned the waiting batteries about Ditton and Esher. At the same time 4 of their fighting machines, similarly armed with tubes, crossed the river, and 2 of black against the western sky, came into sight of myself and the curate as we hurried wearily and painfully along the road that runs northward out of Holyford. They all 7 as it seemed to us, upon a cloud, for a milky mist covered the fields and rose to 1/3 of their height. At this sight the curate cried faintly in his throat, and began running, but I knew it was no good running from a Martian, and I turned aside and crawled through dewy nettles and brambles into the broad ditch by the side of road. He looked back, saw what I was doing, and turned to join me. The 2 halted, the nearer to us standing and Sunbury, the remoter being a grey indistinctness towards the evening star, away towards Staines. The occasional howling of the Martians had ceased. They took up their positions in the huge crescent about their cylinders in absolute silence. It was a crescent with 12 miles between its horns. Never since the devising of gunpowder was the beginning of a battle so still. To us and to an observer about Ripley it would have had precisely the same effect. The Martians seemed in solitary possession of darkling night, lit only as it was by the slender moon, the stars, the afterglow of the daylight, and the ruddy glare from St. George's Hill and the woods of Painshill. But facing that crescent everywhere at Staines, Hounslow, Ditton, Esher, Ockham, hills and south of the river, and across the flat grass meadows to the north of it, wherever a cluster of trees or village houses gave sufficient cover, the guns were waiting. The signal rockets burst and rained their sparks through the night and vanished, and the spirit of all those watching batteries rose to a tense expectation. The Martians had but to advance into the line of fire, and instantly those motionless black forms of men, those guns glittering so darkly in the early night, would explode into a thunderous orgy of battle. No doubt the thought that was uppermost in 1,000 of those vigilant minds, even as it was in mine, was the riddle: how much they understood of us. Did they grasp that in our millions were organized, disciplined, working together? Or did they interpret our spurts of fire, the sudden stinging of our shells, our steady investment of their encampment, as we should the unanimity of onslaught in a disturbed hive of bees? Did they dream they might exterminate us? At that time no one knew what food they needed. 100 such questions struggled together in my mind as I watched that vast sentinel shape. And in the back of my mind was the sense of all the huge unknown and hidden forces London would underscore had they prepared pitfalls. Were the powder mills at Hounslow ready as a snare? Would the Londoners have the heart and courage to make a greater Moscow of their mighty province of houses? Then, after ATL interminable time, as it seemed to us, crouching and peering through the hedge, came a sound like the distant concussion of a gun. Another nearer, and then another. And then the Martian beside us raised his tube on high and discharged it, gunwise, with a heavy that made the ground heave. The one towards Staines answered him. There was no flash, no smoke, simply that loaded detonation. I was so excited by these heavy minute guns following one another that I so far forgot my personal safety and my scalded hands as to clamber up into the hedge and stare towards Sunbury. As I did so a second report followed, and a big projectile hurtled overhead towards Hounslow. I expected at least to see smoke or fire, or some such evidence of its work, but all I saw was the deep blue sky AB01,7E, with one solitary star, and the white mist spreading wide and low near 8_, and there had been no crash, no unsung explosion. The silence was restored, the minute lengthened to 3. Has happened, said the curate, standing up beside me. Hearn knows, said L.A. Bat flickered by and vanished. A distant tumult of shouting began and ceased. I looked again at the Martian, and saw he was now moving eastward along the riverbank, with a swift, rolling motion. Every moment I expected the fire of some hidden battery to spring upon him, but the evening calm was unbroken. The figure of the Martian grew smaller as he receded, and presently the mist and the gathering night had swallowed him up. By a common impulse we clambered higher. Towards Sunbury was a dark appearance, as though a conical hill had suddenly come into being there, hiding our view of the farther country, and then, remoter across the river, over Walton, we saw another such summit. These hill-like forms grew lower and broader as we stared. Moved by a sudden thought, I looked nonward, and there I perceived a third of these cloudy black kopjes had risen. Everything had suddenly become very still. Far away to the southeast, marking the quiet, we heard the Martians hooting to one another, and then the air quivered again with the distant thud of their guns. But the earthly artillery made no reply. Now at the time we could not understand these things, but later I was to learn the meaning of these ominous kopjes that gathered in the twilight. Each of the Manians, standing in the great crescent I have had discharged, by means of gun like he carried, a huge canister over whatever hill, copse, cluster of houses, or other cover for guns, chanced to be in front of him. Some fired only one of these, some two, as in the case of one we had seen. The one at Ripley is said to have discharged no fewer than at that time. These canisters smashed on striking the ground. They did not explode and incontinently disengaged an enormous volume of heavy, inky vapor, coiling and pouring upward in a huge and ebony cumulus cloud, a gaseous hill that sank and spread itself slowly over the surrounding country. And the touch of that vapor, the inhaling of its pungent wisps, was death to all that breathes. It was heavy, this vapor, heavier than the densest smoke, so that, after the first tumultuous uprush and outflow of its impact, it sulked down through the air and poured over the ground in a manner rather liquid than gaseous, abandoning the hills, and streaming into the valleys and ditches and watercourses, even as I have heard the calxmic acid gas that pours from volcanic clefts is wont to do. And where it came upon water some chemical action occurred, and the surface would instantly covered with a powdery scum that sank slowly and made way for more. The scum was absolutely insoluble, and it is a strange thing, seeing the instant effect of the gas, that one could drink hurt the water from which it had been strained. The vapor did not as a true gas would do. It hung together in banks, flowing sluggishly down the slough of land and driving reluctantly before the wind, and very slowly it combined with the mist and moisture of the air, and sulked to the earth in the form of dust. Saw that ATL unknown element giving a group of 4 lines in the blue of the spectrum is concerned, we are still entirely ignorant of the nature of this substance. Once the tumultuous upheaval of its dispersion was over, the black smoke clung so closely to the ground, even its precipitation, that 50 feet up in the air, on the roofs and upper stories of high houses and on great trees, there was a chance of escaping its poison altogether, as was proved even that night at Street Cobham and Ditton. The man who escaped at the former place tells a story of the strangeness of its coiling flow, and how he looked down from the church spire and saw the houses of the village rising like ghosts out of its inky nothingness. For a day and a half he remained there, weary, starving and sun-scorched, the eel under the blue sky and against the prospect of the distant hills a velvet black expanse, with red RNFS, green trees, and, later, black riled shrubs and gates, bams, outhouses, and walls, rising here and there into the sunlight, but that was at street where the black vapor was allowed to remain until it sank of its own accord into the ground. As a rule the Manians, when it had served its purpose, cleared the air of it again by wading into it and directing a jet of steam upon it. This they did with the vapor banks near us, as we saw in the starlight from the window of a decent house at Upper Halliford, whither we had returned. From there we could see the searchlights on Richmond Hill and Kingston Hill gump to and fro, and about 11 the windows rattled, and we heard the sound of the huge siege guns that had been put in position there. These continued intermittently for the space of a quarter of an hour, sending chance shots at the invisible Manians at Hampton and Ditton, and then the pale beams of the electric light vanished, and were replaced by a bright red glow. Then the 4th cylinder fell a brilliant green meteor as I learned afterwards, in Bushy Park. Before the guns on the Richmond and Kingston line of hills began, there was a fatal cannonade far away in the south-east, due, I believe, to guns being fired haphazard before the black vapor could overwhelm the gunners. So, setting about it as methodically as men might smoke out a wasp's nest, the Martians spread this strange stifling vapor over the Londonward country. The homes of Crescent slowly mouldy apart, until at last they formed a line from Hanwell to Coombe and Malden. All night through their destructive tubes advanced never once, after the Manian at St. George's Hill was brought to did they give the artillery the ghost of a chance against them. Wherever there was a possibility of guns being laid for them unseen, a fresh canister of the black vapor was discharged, and where the guns were openly displayed the heat ray was brought to bear. By midnight the blazing trees along the slopes of Richmond Park and the glare of Kingston Hill threw their light upon a network of black smoke, blotting out the whole valley of the Thames and extending as far as the eye could reach, and through this 2 Manians slowly waded, and tumbled their hissing steam jets this way and that. They were sparing of the heat ray that night, either because they had but a limited supply of material for its production, or they did not wish to destroy the country but only to crush and overawe the opposition they had aroused. In the latter aim they certainly succeeded. Sunday night was the end of organized opposition to them all 7 immense after that no of men would stand against them, so hopeless was the enterprise. Even the crews of the torpedo boats and destroyers that had brought their quick firers up the Thames were asked to stop, mutinied, and went down again. The only offensive operation men ventured after that night was preparation of mines and pitfalls, and Ewan in that their energies were frantic and spasmodic. One has to imagine, as well as one may, the fight of those batteries towards Esher, waiting so tensely in the twilight. Survivors there were none. One may picture the orderly expectation, the officers alert and watchful, the gunners ready, the ammunition piled to hand, the limber gunners their horses and wagons, the groups of civilian spectators standing as near as they were the evening stillness, the ambulances and hospital tents with the burned and wounded from Weybridge, then the dull resonance of shots the Manians fired, and the clumsy projectile whirling over the trees and houses and smashing amid the neighboring fields. One may picture, too, the sudden shifting of the attention, the swiftly spreading coils and bellyings of that blackness advancing headlong, towering heavenward, turning the twilight to a palpable darkness, a strange and horrible antagonist of vapor striding upon its victims, men and horses near it seen dimly, running, shrieking, headlong, shouts of dismay, the guns suddenly abandoned, men choking and writhing on the ground, and the swift broadening out of the opaque cone of smoke. And then night and extinction, nothing but a silent mass of impenetrable vapor hiding its decal before dawn. The black vapor was pouring through the streets of Richmond, and the disintegrating organism of government was, with a last expiring effort, rousing the population of London to the necessity of flight. Chapter_16 The Exodus from London. So you understand the roaring wave of fear that swept through the greatest city in the world just as Monday was dawning, the stream of flight rising swiftly to a torrent, lashing in a foaming tumult round the railway stations, banked up into a horrible struggle the shipping in the Thames, and hurrying by every available channel northward and eastward. By 10 o'clock the police organization, and by midday even the railway organizations, were losing coherency, losing shape and efficiency, guttering, softening, running at last in that swift liquefaction of the social body. All the railway lines north of the Thames and the southeastern people at Cannon Street had been warned by midnight on Sunday, and trains were being filled. People were fighting savagely for standing room in the carriages Ewan at 2 o'clock. By 3, people were being trampled and crushed even in Bishopsgate Street, a couple of 100 yards or more from Liverpool Street Station. Revolvers were fired, people stabled, and the policemen who had been sent to direct the traffic, exhausted and infuriated, were breaking the heads of the people they were called out to protect. And as the day advanced and the engine drivers and stokers to return to London, the pressure of the flight drew other people in an ever-thickening multitude away from the stations and along the northward running roads. By midday a manian had been seen at Barnes, and a cloud of slowly sinking black vapor drove along the Thames and across the flats of Lambeth, cutting off all escape over the bridges in its sluggish advance. Another bank drove 7 over Ealing, and surrounded a little island of Sir Eors on Castle Hill, but unable to escape. After a fruitless struggle to get a Northwestern train at Chalk Farm, the engines of the trains that had loaded in the goods yard there ploughed through shrieking, and a dozen stalwart men fought to keep the crowd from crushing the driver against his finis. My brother emerged upon the Chalk Farm road, dodged across through a hurrying swarm of vehicles, and had the luck to be foremost in the Sackaffer Seeweiler shop. The front tire of the machine he got was punctured in dragging it through the window, but he got up and off notwithstanding, with no other injury than a cut wrist. The steep foot of Herstock Hill was impassable owing to several overturned horses, and my brother stmck into Belsize Road. So he got out of the fury of the panic, and, skirting the Edgware Road, reached Edgware 7, fasting and wearied, but well ahead of the crowd. Along the road people were standing in the roadway, curious, wondering. He was passed by a number of cyclists, some horsemen, and 2 motor cars. A mile from Edgware the rim of the wheel broke, and the machine became unrideable. He left it by the roadside and trudged through the village. There were shops half opened in the main street of the place, and people crowded on the pavement and in the doorways and windows, staring astonished at this extraordinary procession of fugitives that was beginning. He succeeded in getting some food at an inn. For a time he remained in Edgware, not knowing what next to do. The flying people increased in number. Many of them, like my brother, seemed inclined to loiter in the place. There was no fresh news of the invaders from Mars. At that time the road was crowded, but as yet from congested. Most of fugitives at that hour were mounted on cycles, but there were soon motor cars, hansom cabs, and carriages hurrying along, and the dust hung in heavy clouds along the road to St. Albans. It was perhaps a vague idea of making his way to Chelmsford, where some friends of his lived, that at last induced my brother to into a quiet lane running eastward. Presently he came upon a stile, and, crossing it, followed a footpath northeastward. He passed near several farmhouses and some little places whose names he did not learn. He saw few fugitives until, in a grass lane towards High Barnet, he happened upon two ladies who became his fellow travellers. He came upon them just in time to save them. He heard their screams, and, hurrying round the comer, saw a couple of men struggling to drag them out of little pony chaise in which they had driving, while a third with difficulty held the frightened Pong's head. One of the ladies, a Shan woman dressed in white, was simply screaming. The other, a dark, slender figure, slashed at the man who gripped her arm with a whip she held in her disengaged hand. My brother immediately the situation, shouted, and hurried towards the struggle. One of the men desisted and turned towards, and my brother, realizing from his antagonist's face that a fight was unavoidable, and being an expert boxer, went into him forthwith and sent him down against the wheel of the chaise. It was no time for pugilistic chivalry, and my brother laid him quiet with a kick, and gripped the collar off man who pulled at the slender lady's arm. He heard the clatter the whip stun across his. A third antagonist struck him the eyes, and the man he held wrenched himself free and made off down the lane in the direction from which he had come. Partly stunned, he found himself facing the man who had held the horse's head, and became aware of the chaise receding from him down the lane, swaying from side to side, and with the omen in it looking back. The man before him, a burly rough, tried to close, and he stopped him with a blow in the face. Then, realizing that he was deselted, he dodged round and made off down the lane after the chaise. The sturdy man closed him, and the fugitive, who had turned now, following remotely. Suddenly he stumbled and fell. His immediate pursuer went headlong, and he rose to his feet to find himself with a couple of antagonists again. He would have had little chance against them had not the slender lady very pluckily pulled up and returned to his help. It seems she had had a revolver all this time, but it had under the seat when she and her companion were attacked. She fired at 6 yards distance, narrowly missing my brother. The less courageous of the robbers made off, and his companion followed, cursing his cowardice. They stopped in sight down the lane, where the third man lay insensible. "Take this," said the slender lady, and she gave my brother her revolver. "Go back to the chaise," said my brother, wiping the blood from his split lip. She turned without a word. They were panting, and they went back to where the lady in white struggled to hold back the frightened pony. The robbers had evidently had enough of it. When my brother looked again, they were retreating. "I'll sit here," said my brother, "if I may," and he got upon the empty front seat. The lady looked over her shoulder. "Give me the reins," she said, and laid the whip along the pony's side. In another moment a bend in the road hid the three men from my brother's eyes. So, quite unexpectedly, my brother found himself, panting, with a cut-abmized jaw, and blood-stained knuckles, driving along an unknown lane with these two women. He leaned. They were the wife and the younger sister of a surgeon living at Stanmore, who had come in the small hours from a dangerous case at Pinner, and heard at some railway station on his way off Moulton Advance. He had hurried home, roused the women. Their servant had left them 2 days before, packed some provisions, put his revolver under the seat luckily for my brother, and told them to drive on to Edgware, with the idea of getting a train there. He stopped at Hind to tell the neighbours. He would 01 take them, he said, at about 4:30 in the morning, and now it was nearly 9 and they had seen nothing of him. They could not stop in Edgware because of growing traffic through the place, and so they had come into this side lane. That was the story they told my brother in fragments when presently they stopped again, nearer to New Barnet. He promised to stay with them, at least until they could determine what to do, or until the missing man arrived, and professed to be an expert shot with the revolver, a weapon strange to him, in order to give them confidence. They made a sort of encampment by the wayside, and the pony became happy in the hedge. He told them of his old escape out and all that he knew of these Martians and their ways. The sun crept higher in the sky, and after a time their talk died out and gave place to an uneasy state of anticipation. Several wayfarers came along the lane, and of these my brother gathered such news as he could tell. Every broken answer he had deepened his impression of the great disaster that had come on humanity, deepened his persuasion of the immediate necessity for prosecuting this flight. He urged the matter upon them. "We have money," said the slender woman, and hesitated. Her eyes met my brother's, and her hesitation ended. "So have I," said my brother. She explained that they had as much as £30 in gold, besides a FME pound note, and suggested that if that they might get upon a tram at St. Albans or New Barnet. My brother thought that was hopeless, seeing the off-Londoners tar crowd upon the trains, and broached his own idea of striking across Essex towards Harwich and thence escaping from the country altogether. Nurse_Elphinstone, that was the name of the woman in white, would listen to no reasoning, and kept calling upon George, but her sister-in-law was astonishingly quiet and at last agreed to my brother's suggestion. So, designing to cross the Great North Road, they went on towards Barnet, my brother leading the pony to save it as much as possible. As the sun crept up the sky the day became excessively hot, and underfoot a thick, whitish sand grew burning and blinding, so that they troll 7E11 ed only very slowly. The hedges were grey with dust. And as they advanced towards Baymay a tumultuous murmuring grew stronger. They began to meet more. For the most part these were staring before, murmuring indistinct questions, jaded, haggard, unclean. One man in evening dress passed them on foot, his eyes on the ground. They heard his voice, and, looking back at him, saw one hand clutched in his hair and the other beating invisible things. His paroxysm of rage over, he went on his way without once looking back. As my brother's party went on towards the crossroads to the south of Barnet, they saw a woman approaching the road across some fields on their left, carrying a child and with 2 other children, and then passed a man in dirty black, a thick stick in one hand and a small portmanteau in the other. Then round the corner of the lane, from between the villas that guarded it at its confluence with the high road, came a little cart drawn by a sweating black pony and driven by a sallow youth in a bowler hat, grey with dust. There were 3 girls, East End actory girls, and a couple of little children crowded in the cart. "This lus round Edgware?" asked the driver, wild-eyed, white-faced, and when my brother told him it Ulcliffe he tumbled to the left. He whipped up at once without the formality of thanks. My brother noticed a pale grey smoke or haze rising among the houses in front of Thames, and veiling the white facade of a terrace beyond the road that ran between the backs of the villas. Mrs. Elphinstone suddenly cried out at a number of tongues of smoky red flame leaping up the houses in front of them against the hot, blue sky. The tumultuous noise resolved itself now into the disorderly mingling of many voices, the gride of many wheels, the creaking of wagons, and the staccato of hooey. The lane came round sharply not 50 yards from the crossroads. "Heavens!" cried LVFRS Elphinstone. "L% is this you are driving us into?" My brother stopped. For the main road was a boiling stream of people, a torrent of human beings rushing onward, one pressing on another. A great bank of dust, white and luminous in the blaze of the sun, made everything within 20 feet off ground grey and indistinct, and was perpetually renewed by the hurrying feet of a dense crowd of horses and of men and women on foot, and by the wheels of vehicles of every description. "Way!" my brother heard voices crying. "Make way!" It was like riding into the smoke of a fire to approach the meeting point of lane and road. The crowd roared afire, and the dust was hot and pungent. And, indeed, a little way up the road a villa was burning and sending rolling masses of black smoke across the road to add to the concealed. 2 men came past them. Then a dirty woman, carrying a heavy bundle and weeping. A lost retriever dog, with hanging tongue, circled dubiously round, scared and wretched, and fled at my brother's threat. So much as they could see of the road Londonward, the houses to the right, was a tumultuous stream of dirty, hurrying people. In between the villas on either side, the black heads, the crowded grew into distinctness as they lushed towards the comer, hurried past, and merged their individuality again in a receding multitude that was swallowed up at last in a cloud of dust. "Go on! Go on!" cried the voices. "Way! way. One man's hands pressed on the back of another. My brother stood at the pony's head. Irresistibly attracted, he advanced slowly, pace by pace, down the lane. Edgware had been a scene of contortion, chalk farmer riotous tumult, but this was a whole population in Mole 7 ement _ it is hard to imagine that host. It had no character of its own. The figures poured out past the comer, and receded their backs to the group in the lane. Along the margin came those who were on foot threatened by the wheels, stumbling in the ditches, blundering into one another. The cans and carriages crowded close upon one another, making little way for those swifter and more impatient vehicles that darted forward every now and then when an opportunity showed itself of doing so, sending the people scattering against the fences and gates of the villas. "Push on," was the cry. "Push on. They are coming." In one cart a blind man in the uniform of the Salvation Army, gesticulating with his crooked fingers and bawling, "Eternity! Eternity!" His voice was hoarse and very loud so that my brother could hear him long after he was lost to sight in the dust. Some of the people who crowded in the cans whipped stupidly at their horses and quarreled with other droll 7ers, some sat motionless, staring at nothing with miserable eyes, some gnawed their hands thirst, or lay prostrate in the bottoms of their conveyances. The horses' bits were covered with foam, their eyes bloodshot. There were cabs, carriages, shop cars, wagons, beyond counting, a mail can, a road cleaner's cart marked Vestry of St. Pancras, a huge timber wagon crowded with roughs. A brewer's dray numbled by with its two near wheels splashed with fresh blood. "Clear the way," cried the M.I.'s _ "clear the way." "Eternity! Eternity!" came echoing down the road. There were sad, haggard omen tramping by, well dressed, with children that cried and stumbled, their dainty clothes smothered in dust, their weary smeared with tears. With many of these came men, sometimes helpful one, sometimes lowering and savage. Fighting side by side with them pushed some weary street outcast in fight black rags, wide-eyed, loud-voiced, and foul-mouthed. There were sturdy workmen thrusting their way along, etched, unkempt men, clothed like clerks or shopmen, struggling spasmodically, a wounded soldier my brother noticed, men dressed the clothes of railway porters, one wretched creature in a nightshirt with a coat thrown over it. But varied as its composition was, 9 things all that host had in common. There were fear and pain on their faces, and fear behind them. A tumult up the road, a quarrel for a place in a wagon, sent the whole host of them quickening their pace. Even a man so scared and broken that his knees bent under him was galvanized for a moment into renewed activity. The heat and dust had already been at work upon this multitude. Their skins were dry, their lips black and cracked. They were all thirsty, weary, and footsore. And amid the various cries one heard disputes, reproaches, growls of weariness and fatigue. The voices of most of them were hoarse and weak. Through it all ran a refrain, "Way! Way! The Martians are coming!" Few stopped and came aside from that flue. The lane opened slantingly into the main road with a narrow opening, and had a delusive appearance of coming from the direction of London. Yet a kind of eddy of people drove into its mouth, weaklings elbowed out off stream, who for the most part rested but a moment afore plunging into it again. A little way down the lane, with 2 friends bending over him, lay a man with a bare leg, wrapped about with bloody rags. He was a lucky man to have friends. A little old man, with a grey military moustache and a filthy black frock coat, limped out and sat down the trap, removed his sock, was blood-stained, shook out her and hobbled on again, and then a little girl of 8 or 9, all alone, threw herself under the hedge close by my brother, weeping. "I go on. I can't go on." My brother woke from his torpor of astonishment and lifted her up, speaking gently to her, and carried her to Miss Elphinstone. So soon as my brother touched her she became quite still, as if frightened. "Ellen!" shrieked a woman in the crowd, with tears in her voice, "Ellen!" And the child suddenly darted away from my brother, crying, "Mother!" "They are coming," said a man on horseback, riding past along the lane. Out of way, there, bawled a coachman, towering high, and my brother saw a closed carriage turning into the lane. The people crushed back on one another to ward the horse. My brother pushed the pony and chaise back into the hedge, and the man drove by and stopped at the turn of the way. It was a carriage, with a pole for a pair of horses, but only one was in the traces. My brother saw dimly through the dust that men lifted out something on a white stretcher and put it gently on the grass the privet hedge. One of the men came running to my brother. "Where is there any water?" he said. "He is dying fast, and very thirsty." "It is Lord Garrick." "Lord Garrick," said my brother, "the Chief Justice." "The water," he said. "There may be a tap," said my brother, "in some of the houses. We have no ivater _ I dare not leave my people." The man pushed against the crowd towards the gate of the corner house. "Go on," said the people, thrusting at him. "They are coming. Go on." Then my brother's attention was distracted by a bearded man lugging a small handbag, which split even as my brother's eyes rested on it and disgorged a mass of sovereigns that seemed to break up into separate coins as it struck the ground. They rolled hither and thither among the struggling feet, half men and horses. The man stopped and looked stupidly at the heap, and the shaft of a cab struck his shoulder and sent him reeling. He gave a shriek and dodged back, and a cartwheel shall sevenicle him narrowly. "Way!" cried the men all about him. "Make way!" So soon as the cab had passed, he flung himself, with hands open, upon the heap of coins, and began thrusting handfuls in his pocket. A horse rose close upon, and in another moment, half rising, he had been down under the horses. "Stop!" screamed my brother, and pushing a woman out of his way, tried to clutch the bit off horse. Before he could get to it, he heard a scream under the wheels, and saw through the dust the rim passing over the poor wretch's back. The driver of the cart slashed his whip at my brother, who ran round behind the cart. The multitudinous shouting convulsed his ears. The man was writhing in the dust among his scattered money, unable to rise, for the wheel had broken his back, and his lower limbs lay limp and dead. My brother stood up and yelled at the next driver, and a man on a black horse came to his assistance. "Get him out of the road," said he, and, clutching the man's collar with his free hand, my brother lugged him sideways. But he still clutched after his money, and regarded my brother fiercely, hammering at his arm with a handle one of gold. "Go on! Go on!" shouted angry voices behind. "Way! Way!" There was a smash as the pole of a carriage crashed into the can that the man on horseback. My brother looked up, and the man with the gold twisted his head round and bit the wrist that held his collar. There was a concussion, and the black horse came staggering sideways, and the cart horse pushed beside it. A hoof missed my brother's foot by a hair's breadth. He released his grip on the Allen man and jumped back. He saw anger change to terror on the face of the poor Tetch on the ground, and in a moment he was hidden, and my brother was borne backward and caltied past the entrance of the lane, and had to fight hard in the torrent to recover it. He saw Miss Elphinstone covering her eyes, and a little child, with all a child's want of sympathetic imagination, staring dilated eyes at a dusty something that lay black and still, ground and cmshed under the rolling wheels. "Let us go back," he shouted, and began turning the pony round. "We cannot cross this hell," he said, and they went back 100 yards the way they had come, until the fighting crowd was hidden. As they passed the bend in the lane, my brother saw the face of the dying man in the ditch under the privet, deadly white and drawn, and shining with perspiration. The two women sat silent, crouching in their seat and shivering. Then beyond the bend my brother stopped again. Miss Elphinstone was white and pale, and her sister-in-law sat weeping, wretched even to call upon George. My brother was horrified and perplexed. So soon as they had retreated he realized how urgent and unavoidable it was to attempt this crossing. He turned to Miss Elphinstone, suddenly resolute. "We must go that way," he said, and led the pony round again. For the second time that day this girl proved her quality. To force their way into the torrent of people, my brother plunged into the traffic and held back a cab horse, while she drove the pony across its head. A wagon locked wheels for a moment and ripped a long splinter from the chaise. In another moment they were caught and swept forward by the stream. My brother, with the cabman's whip marks red across his face and hands, scrambled into the chaise and took the reins from her. "Point the revolver at the man behind," he said, giving it to her, "if he presses us too hard." "No. Point it at his horse." Then he began to look out for a chance of edging to the right across the road. But once in the stream he seemed to lose volition, to a part of that dusty route. They swept through Chipping Barnet with the torrent. They were nearly a mile beyond the center of the town before they had fought across to the opposite side of the way. It was dim and convulsively indescribable, but in and beyond the town the road forks repeatedly, and this to some extent relieved the stress. They struck eastward through Hadley, and there on either side off-road, and at another place farther on they came upon a great multitude of people drinking at the stream, some fighting to come at the water. And on, from a lull near East Barnet, they saw two trains running slowly one after the other without signal or order, trains swarming with people, with men among the coals behind the engines, going nonward along the Great Nonham Railway. My brother they must have filled outside London, for at that time the terror of the people had rendered the central termini impossible. Near this place they halted for the rest of the afternoon, for the violence of the day had already utterly exhausted all three of them. They began to suffer the beginnings of hunger, the night was cold, and none of them dared to sleep. And in the evening many people came hurrying along the road nearby their stopping place, fleeing from unknown dangers for them, and going in the direction from which my brother had come. Chap T_18_ The Thunderchild had the Martians aimed only at destruction. They might on Monday have annihilated the entire population of London, as it spread itself slowly through the home counties. Not only along the road through Barnet, but also through Edgware and Waltham Abbey, and along the roads eastward to Southend and Shoeburyness, and south of the Thames to Deal and Broadstairs, poured the same frantic rout. If one could have hung that June morning in a balloon in the blazing blue London, every northward and eastward road running out of the tangled maze of streets would have seemed stippled black with the streaming each dot a human agony of terror and physical distress. I have set forth at length in the last chapter my brother's account of the road through Chipping Barnet, in order that my readers may realize how that swarming of black dots appeared to one of those concerned. Never before in the history of the world had such a mass of human beings moved and suffered together. The legendary hosts of Goths and Huns, the hugest armies Asia has ever seen, had been but a drop in that current. And this was no disciplined march, it was a stampede gigantic and terrible, without order and without a goal. 6 million people unarmed and unprovisioned, driving headlong. It was the beginning of rout of civilization, of the massacre of mankind. Directly allow him the balloonist would have seen the network of streets and wide houses, churches, squares, crescents, gardens, already derelict, spread out like a huge map, and in the southward blotted. Or Ealing, Richmond, Wimbledon, it would have seemed as if some monstrous pen had flung ink upon the chart. Steadily, incessantly, each black splash grew and spread, shooting out ramifications this way and that, now banking itself against rising ground, now pouring swiftly over a crest into a new-found valley, exactly as a gout of inculcal spread itself upon blotting paper. And beyond, over the blue hills that rise south of the river, the glittering Martians went to and fro, calmly and methodically spreading their cloud over this patch of country and then over that, laying it again with their steam jets when it had served its purpose, and taking possession of the conquered country. They do not seem to have aimed at extermination so much as at complete demoralization and the destruction of any. They exploded any stores of powder they came upon, cut every telegraph, and wrecked the railways here and there. They were hamstringing mankind. They seemed in no hurry to extend the field after operations, and did not come beyond the central part of London all that day. It is possible that a very considerable number of people in London stuck to their houses through Monday morning. Certain it is that many died at home suffocated by the black smoke. Until about midday the Pool of London was an astonishing scene. Steamboats and shipping of all sorts lay there, tempted by the enormous sums of money offered by fugitives, and it is said that many who swam out to these vessels were thrust off with boat hooks and drowned. 1 o'clock in the afternoon the thinning remnant of a cloud of the black vapour appeared between thirches of Blackfriars Bridge. At that there became a scene of mad fighting, and collision, and for some time a multitude of boats and barges jammed in the Nunhern arch of the Tower Bridge, and the sailors and lightermen had to fight savagely against the people who swarmed upon them from the riverfront. People were actually clambering down the piers of the bridge from when, an hour later, a Martian appeared beyond the clock tower and waded down the river. Nothing but wreckage floated above Limehouse. Off fifth cylinder I hail presently to tell the sixth star fell at Wimbledon. My brother, keeping watch beside the women the chaise in a meadow, saw the green flash of it far beyond the hills. On Tuesday the little party, still set upon getting across the sea, made its way through the swarming country towards Colchester. The news that the Martians were now off whole of London was confirmed. They had seen at Highgate, and even, it was said, at Neasden. But they did not come into my brother's view until the morrow. That day the scattered multitudes began to realize the urgent need of provisions. As they grew hungry the rights of property ceased to regard it. Farmers were out to defend their cattle sheds, granaries, and ripening root crops with arms in their hands. A number of people now, like my brother, had their faces eastward, and there were some souls even going back towards London to get food. These were chiefly from the Nunhern suburbs, whose knowledge of the black smoke came by hearsay. He heard that about half the members of the government had gathered at and that enormous quantities of high explosives were being prepared to be used in automatic mines across the Midland counties. He was also told that the Midland Railway Company had replaced the diesel irons of the first day's panic, had resumed traffic, and was running northward trains from St Albans to relieve the congestion of the home counties. There was also a placard in Chipping-Ongar announcing that large stores of flour were available in the Northam towns and that within 24 hours bread would be distributed among the starving people in the neighborhood. But this intelligence did not deter him from the plan of escape he had formed, and the three pressed eastward all day, and heard no more of the bread distribution than this promise. Nor, as a matter of did anyone else hear more of it. That night fell the seventh star, falling upon Primrose Hill. It fell while Miss Elphinstone was watching, for she took that duty ultimately with my brother. She saw it. On Wednesday the three fugitives they had passed the night in a field of unripe wheat reached Chelmsford, and there a body of the inhabitants, calling itself the Committee of Public Supply, seized the pony as provisions, and would give nothing in exchange for it but the promise of a share in it the next day. Here there were rumours of Manians at Epping, and news of the demolition of Waltham Abbey powder mills in a vain attempt to blow up one of the invaders. People were watching for Martians here from the church towers. My brother, very luckily for him as it chanced, preferred to push on at once to the coast rather than wait for food, although all three of them were very hungry. By midday they passed through Tillingham, which, strangely seemed to lie quite silent and desolate, save for a few furtive plunderers hunting for food. Near Tillingham they suddenly came in sight of the sea, and the most amazing crowd of shipping of all sons that it is possible to imagine. For after the sailors could no longer come up the Thames, they came on to the Essex coast, to Hamwyke and Walton and Clacton, and afterwards to Foulness and Showbury, to bring off the people. They lay in a huge sickle-shaped curve that vanished into mist at last towards the Naze. Close inshore was a multitude of fishing smacks, English, Scotch, French, Dutch, and Swedish, steam launches from the Thames, yachts, electric and beyond were ships of larger multitude of filthy colliers, trim merchantmen, cattle ships, passenger boats, petroleum tanks, ocean tramps, and old white even, neat white and grey liners from Southampton and Hamburg, and along the blue coast across the black water. My brother could make out dimly a dense swarm of chaffering with the people on the Assuam, which also extended up the Blackwater almost to Malden. A couple of miles out lay an ironclad, very low in the water, almost, to my Brothy's percepticule like a waterlogged ship. This was the Ron Thunder Chilkal. It was the only warship in sight, but far away to the right over the smooth surface of C4 that day there was a dead calm, lay a current of black smoke to mark the next ironclads of the Channel Fleet, which hovered in an extended line, steam up and ready for action, across the Thames estuary during the course of the Martian conquest, vigilant and yet powerless to prevent it. At the sight of the sea, Mrs. Elphinstone, spite of the assurances of her sister-in-law, gave way to panic. She had never ironed out of England before, she would rather die than trust herself friendless in a foreign country, and so forth. She seemed, poor woman, to imagine that the French and the Martians might prove very similar. She had been growing increasingly hysterical, fearful, and depressed during the 2 days' journeyings. Her great idea was to return to Stanmore. Things had been always well and safe at Stanmore. They would find George at Stanmore _ it was with the greatest difficulty they could get her down to the beach, where presently my brother succeeded in attracting the attention of some men on a paddle steamer from the Thames. They sent a boat and drove a bargain for £36 for the three. The steamer was going, these men said, to Ostend. It was 2 o'clock when my brother, having paid their fares at the gangway, found himself safely there with his charges. There was food aboard, all at exorbitant prices, and the three of them contrived to eat a meal on one of the seats forward. There were already a couple of score of passengers, some of whom had expended their last money in securing a passage, but the captain lay off the Blackwater until 5 in the afternoon, picking up passengers until the seated decks were even dangerously crowded. He would probably have remained longer had it not been for the sound of guns that began about that hour in the south. As if in answer, the ironclad Seaward fired a small gun and hoisted a string of flags. A jet of smoke sprang out of her flannels. Some of passengers were of opinion that this firing came from Shoeburyness, until it was noticed that it was growing louder. At the same time, far away in the southeast the masts and upperworks of 3 ironclads rose one after the other out of the sea, beneath clouds of black smoke. But my Brother's attention speedily reverted to the distant firing in the south. He fancied he saw a column of smoke rising out of the distant grey haze. The little steamer was already flapping her way eastward of the big crescent of shipping, and the low Essex coast was growing blue and hazy, when a Martian appeared, small and faint in the remote distance, advancing along the muddy coast from the direction of Foulness _ at that the captain on the bridge swore at the top of his voice with fear and anger at his own delay, and the paddle seemed infected with his terror. Every soul stnd at the bulwarks or on the seats of the steamer and stared at that distant shore higher than the trees or church towers inland, and advancing with a leisurely parody of a human stride. It was the first Martian my brother had seen, and he stood, more amazed than terrified, watching this Titan advancing deliberately towards the shipping, wading farther and farther into the Ivertor as the coast fell away. Then, far away beyond the crouch, came another, striding over some stunted trees, and then yet another, still farther off, wading deeply through a shiny mud flat that seemed to hang half a way up between sea and sky. They were all stalking Semvar, as if to intercept the escape of the multitudinous vessels that were crowded between Foulness and the Naze. In spite of throbbing exertions of the engines of the little paddle boat, and the pumped foam that her wheels flung her, she receded terrifying slowness from this ominous advance. Glancing northwestward, my brother saw the large crescent of shipping already wreathing with the approaching terror, one ship passing behind another, another coming round from broadside to end on, steamships whistling and giving off volumes of steam, sails being let out, launches rushing hither and thither. He was so fascinated by this and by the creeping danger away to the left that he had no eyes for anything seaward. And then a swift movement of the steamboat, she had suddenly come round to avoid being run down, flung him headlong from the seat upon which he was standing. There was a shouting all about him, a trampling of feet, and a cheer that seemed to ire answered faintly. The steamboat lurched and rolled him over upon his hands. He sprang to his feet and saw to starboard, and not 100 yards from their heeling, pitching boat, a vast iron bulk like the blade of a plough tearing through the water, tossing it on either side in huge waves of foam that leaped towards the steamer, flinging her paddles helplessly in the air, and then sucking her deck down almost to the waterline. A douche of spray blinded my brother for a moment. When his eyes were clear again he saw the monster had passed and was rushing landward. Big iron upperworks rose out of this headlong structure, and from that twin projected and spat a smoking blast shot with fire. It was the torpedo ram, Thunderchild, steaming headlong, come to the rescue of the threatened shipping. Keeping his footing on the heaving deck by clutching the bulwarks, my brother looked past this charging Leviathan at the Martians again, and he saw the three of them now close together, and standing so far out to sea that their tripod supports were almost entirely submerged. Thus sunken, and seen in remote perspective, they appeared less formidable than the huge iron bulk in whose wake the steamer was pitching so helplessly. It would seem they were regarding this new antagonist with astonishment. To their intelligence, it may be, the giant was even such another as themselves. The Thunderchild fired no gun, but simply drove all speed towards them. It was probably her not firing that enabled her to get so near the enemy as she did. They did not know what to make of her. One shell, and they would have sent her to the forthwith with the heat ray. She was steaming at such a pace that in a minute she seemed half-way between the steamboat and the Martians, a diminishing black bulk against the receding horizontal expanse of Essex coast. Suddenly the foremost Manian lowered his tiller and discharged a canister of the black gas at the ironclad. It hit her side and glanced off in an inky jet that rolled away to seaward, an unfolding torrent of B1X smoke, from which the ironclad drove clear. To the watchers from the steamer, low in the Iveter and with the sun in their eyes, it seemed as though she were already among the Martians. They saw the gaunt figures separating and rising out of the water as they retreated shore Elvar, and one of them raised the camera-like generator of the heat ray. He held it pointing obliquely downward, and a bank of steam sprang from the water at its touch. It must have driven through the iron of ship's side like a white-hot iron rod through paper. A flicker of flame went up through the rising steam, and then the Martian reeled and staggered. In another moment he was cut down and a great body of water and steam shot high in the air. The guns of the Thunderchild sounded through the reek, going off one after the other, and one shot splashed the water high close by the steamer, ricocheted towards the other flying ships to the north, and smashed a smack to matchwood. But no one heeded that very much. At the sight of the Manians collapse, the captain on the bridge yelled inarticulately, and all the crowding passengers on the steamer's stem shouted together. And then they yelled again. For, surging out beyond the white tumult, drove something long and black. The flames streamed from its middle parts, its ventilators and L1's spouting fire. She was alive still, the steering gear, it seems, Eva's intact and her engines working. She headed straight for a second Martian, and was within 100 yards of him when the heat ray came to. Then with a violent thud, a blinding flash, her decks, her funnels, leaped upward. The Martian staggered with the violence of her explosion, and in another moment the flaming wreckage, still driving forward with the impetus of its pace, had struck him and crumpled him up like a thing of cardboard. My brother shouted involuntarily. A tumult of steam hid everything again. "2!" yelled the captain. Everyone Eva's shouting. The whole steamer from end to end rang with frantic cheering that was taken up first by one and then by all in the crowding multitude of ships and boats that was driving out to sea. The steam hung upon the water for many minutes, hidden the third Manian and the coast altogether. And all this time the boat was paddling steadily out to sea and away from the fight, and when at last the contortion cleared, the drifting bank of black vapor intervened, and nothing of the Thunderchild could be made out, nor could the third Martian be seen. But the ironclads to seaward were now quite close and standing in towards shore past the steamboat. The little vessel continued to beat its way seaward, and the ironclads receded slowly towards the coast, which was hidden still by a marbled bank of vapor, part steam, part black gas, eddying and combining in the strangest way. The fleet of Rear-Agis was scattering to the non-east, Sarah-1's were sailing the ironclads and the steamboat. After a time, and before they reached the sinking cloud bank, the warships turned northward, and then abruptly went about and passed into the thickening haze of evening. Southward the coast grew and at last indistinguishable amid the low banks of clouds that were gathering about the sinking sun. Then suddenly out of golden haze of the sunset came the vibration of guns, and a foamy of black shadows moving. Everyone struggled to the rail of the steamer and peered into the blinding harness of the west, but nothing was to be distinguished clearly. A mass of smoke rose slanting and barred the face of the sun. The throbbed on its way through an interminable suspense. The sun sank into grey clouds, the sky flushed and darkened, the evening star trembled into sight. It was deep twilight when the captain cried out and pointed. My brother strained his eyes. Something rushed up into the sky out of the greyness, rushed slantingly upward and very swiftly into the luminous clearness above the clouds in the western sky, something flat and broad, and very large, that swept round in a vast curve, grew smaller, sank slowly, and vanished again into the grey mystery of the night. And as it flew it rained down darkness upon the land. Book 2 Chapter Underfoot. In the first book I have wandered so much from my own adventures to tell of the experiences of my brother that all through the last 2 chapters I and the curate have been lurking in the empty house at Holyford, whither we fled to escape the black smoke. There I will resume. We stopped there all Sunday night and all the next day, the day of the Pumpkin, a little island of daylight, cut off by the black smoke from the rest of the world. We could do nothing but wait in aching inactivity during those 2 weary days. My mind was occupied by anxiety for my wife. I figured her at Leatherhead, terrified, in danger, mourning me already as a dead man. I paced the rooms and cried aloud when I thought of how I was cut off from her, of all that might happen to her in my absence. My cousin I knew was brave enough for any emergency, but he was not the sort of man to realize danger quickly, to rise promptly. Was needed now Eva's not bravery, but circumspection. My only consolation was to believe that the Manians were moving Londonward and away from her. Such vague anxieties keep the mind sensitive and painful. I grew very weary and irritable with the curate's ejaculations. I tired of the sight of his selfish despair. After some ineffectual remonstrance I kept away from him, staying in a room, evidently a children's schoolroom containing globes, forms, and copybooks. Ilman he followed me thither. I went to her at the top of the house and, in order to alone with my aching miseries, locked myself in. We were hopelessly hemmed in by the black smoke all that day and the morning of the next. There were signs of people in the next house on Sunday evening, a face at a window and moving lights, and later the slamming of a door. But I do not know who these people were, nor what became of them. We saw nothing of them next day. The black smoke drifted slowly riverward all through Monday morning, creeping nearer and nearer to us, driving at last along the roadway outside the house that hid us. A Martian came across the fields midday, laying the stuff. A jet of superheated steam that hissed against the eye valves, smashed all the windows it touched, and scalded the curate's hand as he fled out of front room. When at last we crept across the sodden and looked out again, the country north of us was as though a black snowstorm had passed over it. Looking toward the river, we were astonished to see an unaccountable redness mingling with the black of the scorched meadows. For a time we did not see how this change affected us, save that we were relieved of our fear of black smoke. But later that we were no longer hemmed in, that now we might get away. So as I realized that the way of escape was open, my dream of action resumed. But the curate was lethargic, unreasonable. We are safe here, he narrated, safe here. I resolved to leave him, would that I had. Wiser now for the artilleryman's teaching, I sought out and drink. I had found oil and rags for my burns, and I also a hat and a flannel shin that I found in one of the erdrooms. When it was clear to him that I meant to go alone, had reconciled myself to going alone, he suddenly roused himself to come. And all being quiet throughout the afternoon, we started about 5 o'clock. as I should judge, along the blackened road to Sunbury in Sunbury, and at intervals along the road, were dead bodies lying in contorted attitudes, horses as well as men, overturned carts and luggage, all cawed thickly black dust. That pall of cindery powder made me think of what I had read of the destruction of Pompeii. We got to Hampton Court without misadventure, our minds of strange and unfamiliar appearances, and at Hampton Court our eyes were relieved sevenical to find a patch of green that had escaped the suffocating drift. We went through Bushy Park, with its deer going to and fro under the chestnuts, and some men and women hurrying in the distance towards Hampton, and so we came to Twickenham. These were the first people we saw. Away across the road the Beyond Ham and Petersham were still afire. Twickenham was uninjured by either heat ray or black smoke, and there were more people here, though none could give us news. For the most part they were like ourselves, taking advantage of a lull to shift their quarters. I have an impression that many of the houses here were still occupied by scared inhabitants, too frightened even for flight. Here too the evidence of a hasty rout was abundant along the road. I remember most vividly 3 smashed bicycles in a heap, pounded into the road by the wheels of subsequent carts. We crossed Richmond Bridge about 8:30. We hurried across the exposed bridge, of course, but I noticed floating down the streamer of red masses, some many feet across. I did not know what these were. There was no time for scrutiny, and I put a more horrible interpretation on them than they deserved. Here again on the Surrey side were black dust that had once been smoke, and dead heap near the approach to the station, but we had no glimpse of Martians until we were some way towards Barnes. We saw in the blackened distance a group of 3 people running down a side street towards the river, but otherwise it seemed deserted. Up the hill Richmond Town was burning briskly. Outside the town of Richmond there was no trace of black smoke. Then suddenly, as we approached Kew, came a number of people running, and the upperworks of a Manian fighting machine loomed in sight over the housetops, not 100 yards away from us. We stood aghast at our danger, and had the Martian looked down we must immediately have perished. We were so terrified that we dared not go on, but turned aside and hid in a shed in a garden. There the curate crouched, weeping silently, and refusing to stir again. But my fixed idea of reaching Leatherhead would not let me rest, and in the twilight I endured out again. I went through a shrubbery, and along a passage beside a big house standing in its own grounds, and so emerged upon the road towards Kew. The curate I left in the shed, but he came hurrying after me. That second staff was the most foolhardy thing I ever did. For it was manifest the Manians were us. No sooner had the curate overtaken me than we saw either the fighting machine we had seen before or another, away across the meadows in the direction of Kew Lodge. 4 or 5 little black figures hurried before it across the green grey of the field, and in a moment it was evident this Martian pursued them. In 3 strides he was among them, and they ran radiating from his feet in all directions. He used no heat ray to destroy them, but picked them up one by one. Apparently he tossed them into the great metallic carrier which projected behind him, much as a workman's basket hangs over his shoulder. It was the first time I realized that the Martians might have any other purpose than destruction with defeated humanity. We for a moment petrified, then turned and fled through a gate behind us into a walled garden, fell into, rather than found, a fortunate ditch, and lay there, scarce daring to whisper to each other until the stars were out. I suppose it was nearly 11 o'clock. We gathered courage to start again, no longer venturing into the road, but sneaking along hedgerows and through plantations, and watching keenly through the darkness, he on the right and I on the left, for the Martians, who seemed to be all about us. In one place we blundered upon a scorched and blackened area, now cooling and ashen, and a number of scattered dead bodies of men, bummed horribly the heads and trunks but with their legs and boots mostly intact, and of dead horses, 50 feet, perhaps, behind a line of 4 guns and smashed gun carriages. Sheen, it seemed, had escaped destruction, but the place was silent and deserted. Here we happened on no dead, though the night was dark for us to see into the side roads of the place. In Sheen my companion suddenly complained of faintness and thirst, and we decided to try one of the houses. The first house we entered, after a little difficulty with the window, was a small semi-detached villa, and I found nothing eatable left in the place but some mouldy cheese. There was, however, water to drolg, and I took a hatchet, which promised to be in our next house breaking. We then crossed to a place where the road turns towards Munlake here there a white house within a walled garden, and in the pantry office domicile we found a store of food, 2 loaves of bread in a pan, and steak, and the half of a ham. I give this catalogue so precisely because, as it happened, we were destined to subsist upon this store for the next fortnight. Bottled beer stood under a shelf, and there were 2 bags of haricot irons and some limp lettuces. This pantry into a kind of wash-up kitchen, and in this was firewood. There was also a cupboard, in which we found nearly a dozen of burgundy, tinned soups and salmon, and 2 tins of biscuits. We sat in the adjacent kitchen in the dark for we dared not strike a light, and ate bread and ham, and drank beer out of the same. The curate, who was still timorous and restless, was now, oddly enough, for pushing on, and I was urging him to keep up his strength by eating when the thing happened that was to imprison us at midnight. Yet I said, and then came a blinding glare of vivid green light. Everything in the kitchen leaped out, clearly visible in green and black, and vanished again. And then followed such a concussion as I have never heard or since. So close on the heels of this as to seem instantaneous came a thud behind me, a clash of glass, a crash and rattle of masonry all alciutas, and the plaster of the ceiling came down upon us smashing into a multitude of fragments upon our heads. I was knocked headlong across the floor against the oven handle and stunned. I was insensible for a long time, the curate told me, and when I came to we were in darkness and he, with a face wet, as I found afterwards, with blood from a cut forehead, was dabbing water over me. For some time I could not recollect what had happened. Then THMGS came to me slowly. A bruise on my temple assented itself. Are you better? Asked the curate in a whisper. At last I answered him. I sat up. Dotfi move, he said. The floor is covered with smashed crockery from the dresser. You can't possibly move without making a noise, and I fancy they are outside. We both sat quite silent, so that we could scarcely hear each other breathing. Everything seemed deadly still, but once something near us, some plaster or broken brickwork, slid down with a rumbling sound. Outside and very near was an intermittent, metallic rattle. That, said the curate, when presently it happened again. Yes, I said. But what is it? A manian, said the curate. I listened again. It was not like the heat ray, I said, and for a time I was inclined to think one of great fighting machines had stumbled against the house, as I had seen one stumble against the tower of Shepperton Church. Our situation was so strange and incomprehensible that for 3 or 4 hours, until the dawn came, we scarcely moved. And then the light filtered in, not through the window, which remained black, but through a triangular aperture between a beam and a heap of broken bricks in the wall behind us. The interior of the kitchen we now saw greyly for the first time. The window had iron burst in by a mass of garden mould, which flowed over the table upon which we had been sitting and lay about our feet. Outside, the soil was banked high against the house. At the top of window frame we could see an uprooted drain pipe. The floor was littered with smashed hardware, the end of the kitchen towards the house was broken into, and since the daylight shone in there, it was evident the greater part of the house had collapsed. Contrasting vividly with this ruin was the neat dresser, stained in the fashion, pale and with a number of copper and tin vessels below it, the wallpaper imitating blue and white tiles, and a couple of colored supplements fluttering from the walls. The kitchen range. As the dawn grew clearer, we saw through the gap in the wall the body of a manian, standing sentinel, I suppose, over the still glowing cylinder. At the sight of that we crawled as circumspectly as possible out of the twilight off kitchen into the darkness of the scullery. Abruptly the right interpretation dawned upon my Minkel. The 5th cylinder, I whispered, the 5th shot from Mars, has struck this house and buried us under the ruins. For a time the curate was silent, and then he whispered, "God have mercy upon us." I heard him presently whimpering to himself. Save for that sound we lay quite still in the scullery. I for my part scarce dared breathe, and sat with my eyes fixed on the faint light of the kitchen door. I could just see the curate's face, a oval shape, and his collar and cuffs. Outside there began a metallic hammering, then a violent hooting, and then in a quiet interval a hissing like the hissing of an engine. These noises, for the most part problematical, continued intermittently, and seemed if anything to increase in number as time wore on. Presently a measured thudding and a vibration that made everything us quiver and the vessels in the pantry ring and shift, began and continued till once the light was eclipsed, and the ghostly kitchen doorway became absolutely dark. For many hours we must have crouched there, silent and shivering, until our tired attention failed. At last I found myself awake and very hungry. I am inclined to believe we must have spent the greater portion of a day that awakening. My hunger was at a stride so insistent that it moved me to action. I told the curate I was going to seek food, and felt my way towards the pantry. He made me no answer, but so soon as I began eating the noise I made stiffed him up and I heard him crawling after me. CHAPTER_2. Saw from the ruined house. After eating we crept back to the scullery, and there I must have dozed again, for when presently I looked round I was alone. The thudding vibration continued with wearisome persistence. I whispered for the curate several times, and at last felt my way to the of the kitchen. It was still daylight, and I perceived him across the room, lying against the triangular hole that looked out the Martians. His shoulders were hunched, so that his head was hidden from me. I could hear a number of noises almost like those an engine shed, and the place rocked with that beating thud. Through the ivall I could see the top of a tree touched with gold and the warm blue of a tranquil evening sky. For a minute or so I remained watching the curate, and then I advanced, crouching and stepping with extreme care amid the broken crockery that littered the floor. I touched the curate's leg, and he started so violently that a mass of plaster went sliding down outside and fell with a loud impact. I his arm, fearing he might cry out, and for a long time we crouched motionless. Then I turned to see how much of a rampart remained. The detachment of the plaster had left a vertical slit open in the debris, and by raising myself cautiously across a beam I was able to see out of this gap into what had been overnight a quiet suburban roadway. Vast, indeed, was the change that we beheld. The fifth cylinder must have fallen right into the midst of the house we had first visited. The building had vanished, completely smashed, pulverized, and dispersed by the blow. The cylinder lay now beneath the original foundations deep in a hole, already vastly larger than the pit I had looked into at Woking. The earth all round it had splashed under that tremendous impact, splashed is the only word, and lay in piles that hid the masses of adjacent houses. It had behaved exactly like mud under the violent blow of a hammer. Our house had collapsed backward, the front even on the ground floor, had been destroyed completely. By a chance the kitchen and scullery had escaped, and buried now under soil and ruins, closed in by tons of earth on every side save towards the cylinder. Or that aspect we hung now on the very edge of the great circular pit the Martians were engaged in making. The heavy beating sound was evidently just behind us, and ever and again a bright green vapor drove up like a veil across our peephole. The cylinder was already opened in the center of the pit, and on the percent the edge of pit, amid the smashed and gravel heaped one of the great fighting machines, deserted by its occupant, stood stiff and tall against the evening sky. At first I scarcely noticed the pit and the cylinder, although it has been convenient to describe them first, on account of the extraordinary glittering mechanism I saw busy in the excavation, and on account of the strange creatures that were crawling slowly and painfully across the heaped mold near it. The mechanism it certainly was that held my attention first. It was one of those complicated fabrics that have since been called handling machines, and the study of which has already given such an enormous impetus to terrestrial invention. As it dawned upon me first, it presented a sort of metallic spider with 5 jointed, agile legs, and with an extraordinary number of jointed levers, bars, and reaching and clutching tentacles about its body. Most of its arms were retracted, but with 3 long tentacles it was fishing out a number of rods, plates, and bars which lined the covering and apparently strengthened the walls of cylinder. These, as it extracted them, were lifted out and deposited upon a Layer 7E1 surface of Earth behind it. Its motion was so swift, complex, and perfect that at first I did not see it as a machine, in spite of its metallic glitter. The fighting machines were and animated to an extraordinary pitch, but nothing to compare with this. People who hail never seen these structures, and hail only the ill-imagined F-01ts of artists or the imperfect descriptions of such eyewitnesses as myself to go scarcely realize that living quality. I recall particularly the illustration of one of the first pamphlets to give a consecutive account of war. The artist had evidently made a hasty study of one-off fighting machines, and there his knowledge ended. He presented them as tilted, stiff tripods, without either flexibility or subtlety, and with an altogether misleading monotony of effect. The pamphlet containing these renderings had a considerable vogue, and I mention them here simply to warn the reader against the impression they may have created. They were no more like the Martians I saw in action than a Dutch doll is like a human being. To my mind, the pamphlet would have ironed much better without them. At first, I say, the handling machine did not impress me as a machine, but as a crab-like creature with a glittering integument, the controlling motion whose delicate tentacles actuated its movements seeming to be simply the equivalent of the crab's cerebral but then either resemblance of its grey-brown, shiny, leathery integument to that of the other sprawling bee, dies beyond, and the true nature of this dexterous workman dawned upon me. With that realization my interest shined to those other creatures, the real Manians. Already I had had a transient impression of these, and the first nausea no longer obscured my observation. I was concealed and motionless, and under no urgency of action they were, I now saw, the most unearthly creatures it is possible to conceive. They were huge round heads about 4 feet in diameter, each body having in front of it a face. This had no nostrils, indeed. The Manians do not seem to have had any sense of smell, but it had a pair of very large dark-colored eyes, and just this a kind of fleshy rock in the back of its head or body. I scarcely know how to speak of it. Was the single tight tympanic surface, since known to be anatomically an ear, though it must have been almost useless in our dense air. In a group round the mouth were 16 slender, almost whip-like tentacles, arranged in 2 bunches of 8 each. These bunches hail since iron named rather aptly, by that distinguished anatomist, Professor House, the hands. Even as I saw these Martians for the first time they seemed to be endeavoring to raise themselves on these hands, but of course, with the increased weight of terrestrial conditions, this was impossible. There is reason to that on Mars they may have progressed upon them with some the internal anatomy, I may remark here, as dissection has since shown was almost equally simple. The greater part of structure evers the brain, sending enormous nerves to the eyes, ear, and tactile tentacles. Besides this were the bulky lungs, into which the mouth opened, and the heart and its vessels. The pulmonary distress caused by the denser atmosphere and greater gravitational attraction was only evident in the movements of the outer skin. And this was the sum of the Martian organs. Strange as it may seem to a human, all the complex apparatus of digestion, which makes up the bulk of our bodies, did not exist in the Manians. They were heads, merely heads. Entrails they had none. They did not eat, much less digest. Instead, they took the fresh, living blood of other creatures, and injected it into their own veins. I have myself seen this being done, as I shall mention in its place. But, squeamish as I may seem, I cannot bring myself to describe what I could not endure even to continue watching. Let it sum us to say, blood obtained from a still living animal, in most cases from a human being, was run directly by means of a little pipette into the recipient canal. The bare idea of this is no doubt horribly repulsive to us, but at the same time I think that we should remember how repulsive our carnivorous habits would seem to an intelligent rabbit. The physiological advantages of practice of injection are undeniable, if one thinks of the tremendous harvest of human time and energy occasioned by eating and the digestive process. Our are half made up of glands and tubes and organs, occupied in turning heterogeneous food into blood. The digestive processes and their reaction upon the nervous system sap our strength and color our minds. Men go happy or miserable as they have healthy or unhealthy livers, or sound gastric glands. But the Martians were life to all these organic fluctuations of mood and emotion. Their undeniable preference for men as their source of nourishment is partly explained by the nature of the remains of the victims they had brought with them as provisions from Mars. These creatures, to judge from the shriveled remains that have fallen into human hands, were bipeds with flimsy, siliceous skeletons, almost like those of the siliceous sponges, and feeble musculature, standing 6 feet high and having round, erect heads, and large eyes in flinty sockets. 2 or 3 of these seem to have been brought in each cylinder, and all were killed. Earth was reached. It was just as well for them, for the mere attempt to stand upright upon our planet would have broken every in there. And while I am engaged in this descriptive, I may add in this place certain other details which, although they were not all evident to us at the time, will enable the reader who is unacquainted with them to form a clearer picture of these offensive creatures. In 3 other points their physiology differed strangely from ours. Their organisms did not sleep, any more than the heart of man sleeps. Since they had no extensive muscular mechanism to recuperate, that periodical extinction was unknown to them. They had little or no sense of fatigue. It would seem on Earth they could never have morrowed without effort, yet even to the last they kept in action. In 24 hours they did 24 hours of work, as even on Earth is perhaps the case with the ants. In the next place, wonderful as it seems in a sexual world, the Manians were absolutely without sex, and therefore without any of tumultuous emotions that arise from that difference among men. A young Martian, there can now be no dispute, was really upon Earth during the war, and it was found attached to its parent, partially budded off just as young lilybulbs bud off, or like the young animals in the freshwater polyp. In man, in all the higher terrestrial animals, such a method of increase has disappeared, but even on this Earth it was certainly the primitive method. Among the lower animals, up even to those first cousins of the vertebrate animals, the tunicates, the 2 processes occur side by side, but finally the sexual method superseded its competitor altogether. On Mars, however, just the reverse has apparently been the case. It is worthy of remark that a S9 speculative writer of quasi-scientific repute, writing long before the Martian invasion, did forecast for man a final fracture not unlike the actual Manian condition. His prophecy, I remember, appeared in November or December, 1893, in a long defiant publication, the Pall Mall Budget, and I recall a caricature of it in a pre-Martian periodical called Punch. He in a foolish, facetious tone that the perfection of mechanical appliances must ultimately supersede limbs, the of chemical devices, digestion, that such organs as hair, external nose, teeth, ears, and chin were no longer essential parts of the human being, and that the tendency of natural selection would lie in the direction of their steady diminution through the gauges. The brain alone remained a cardinal necessity. Only one other part of the body had a strong case for survival, and that was the hand, teacher and agent of the brain. While the rest of body dwindled, the hands would grow larger. There is many a true word written in jest, and here in the Manians we have beyond dispute the actual accomplishment of such a suppression of the animal side of organism by the intelligence. To me it is quite credible that the Manians may be descended from beings not unlike ourselves, by a gradual development of brain and hands, the latter giving rise to the 2 bunches of delicate tentacles at last, at the expense of the rest of the body. Without the body the brain would, of course, become a mere selfish intelligence, without any of the emotional substratum of the human being. The last salient point in which the systems of these creatures differed from ours was in what one might have thought a very trivial particular. Microorganisms, which cause so much disease and pain on have either never appeared upon Mars or Martian sanitary science eliminated them ages ago. 100 diseases, all the fewest and contagions of human life, consumption, cancers, tumors and such morbidities, never enter the scheme of their life. And speaking of differences between the life on Mars and terrestrial life, I may allude here to the curious suggestions of the red weevil. Apparently the vegetable kingdom in Mars, instead of having green for a dominant color, is of a vivid blood red tint. At any rate, the seeds which the Manians, intentionally or accidentally, brought with them gave rise in all cases to red-colored growths. Only that known popularly as the red weed, however, gained any footing in competition with terrestrial forms. The red creeper was quite a transitory growth, and few people have seen it growing. For a time, however, the red weed grew with astonishing vigor and luxuriance. It spread up the sides of the pit by the third or fourth day of our imprisonment, and its cactus-like branches formed a carmine fringe to the edges of our triangular window. And affine I found it broadcast throughout the country, and especially wherever there was a stream of water. The Martians had what appears to have been an auditory organ, a single round drum at the back of the head body, and eyes with a visual range not very different from ours, except that, according to Phillips, blue and violet were as black to them. It is commonly supposed that they communicated by sounds and tentacular gesticulations. This is asserted, for instance, in the able but hastily compiled pamphlet, written evidently by someone not an eyewitness of Mafian actions, to which I have already alluded, and which, so far, has been the chief source of information concerning them. Now no surviving human being saw so much of the Manians in action as I did. I take no credit to myself for an accident, but the is so. And I assert that I watched them closely time after time, and that I have seen 4, 5, and, once, 6 of them sluggishly performing the most elaborately complicated operations together without either sound or gesture. Their peculiar hooting invariably preceded feeding. It had no modulation, and was, I believe, in no sense a signal, but merely the expiration of air preparatory to the suctional operation. I have a certain claim to at least an elementary knowledge of psychology, and in this matter I am convinced, as firmly as I am convinced of anything, that the Martians interchanged thoughts without any physical intermediator, and I have iron convinced of this in spite of strong preconceptions. Before the Martian invasion, as an occasional reader here or there may remember, I had written with some little vehemence against the telepathic theory. The Martians wore no clothing. Their conceptions of ornament and decorum were necessarily different from ours, and not only were they evidently much less sensible of changes of than we are, but changes of pressure do not seem to have affected their health at all seriously. Yet though they wore no clothing, it was in the other artificial additions to their bodily resources that their great superiority over man lay. We men, with our bicycles and road skates, our Lilienthal soaring machines, our guns and sticks and so forth, are just in the beginning of evolution that the Manians have worked out. They hail become practically mere brains, wearing different indies according to their needs, just as men wear suits of clothes and take a bicycle in a hurry or an umbrella in the wet. And of their appliances, perhaps nothing is more honorable one to a man than the curious fact that what is the dominant feature of almost all human devices in mechanism is absent. The wheel is absent. Among all the things they brought to earth there is no trace or suggestion of their use of wheels. One would have at least it in locomotion. And in this connection it is curious to remark that even on this earth nature has never hit upon the wheel, or has preferred other expedients to its development. And not only did the Martians either not know of, which is incredible, or abstain from, the wheel, but in their apparatus singularly little use is made of the fixed pivot or relatively fixed pivot, with circular motions thereabout confined to one plane. Almost all the joints of the machinery present a complicated system of sliding parts moving over small but beautifully curled friction bearings. And while upon this matter of detail, it is remarkable that the long leverage softer machines are in most cases actuated by a son of sham musculature of the discs in an elastic sheath, These disks become polarized and drawn closely and powerfully together when traversed by a current of electricity. In this way the curious parallelism to animal motions, which was so striking and disturbing to the human beholder, was attained. Such quasi-muscles abounded in the crab-like handling machine which, on my first peeping out of slit, I watched unpacking the cylinder. It seemed infinitely more alive than the actual Martians lying beyond it in the sunset light, panting, stirring ineffectual tentacles, and moving feebly after their vast journey across space. While I was still watching their sluggish motions in the sunlight, and noting each strange detail after the curate reminded me of his presence by pulling violently at my arm. I turned to a scowling face, and silent, eloquent lips. He wanted the slit, which permitted only one of us to peep through, and so I had to forego watching them for a time while he enjoyed that privilege. When I looked again, the busy handling machine had already put together several of the pieces of apparatus it had taken out of cylinder into a shape having an unmistakable to its 01 VN, and down on the left a busy little digging mechanism had come to view, emitting jets of green vapor and working its way round the pit, excavating and embanking in a methodical and discriminating manner. This it was which had caused the regular beating noise, and the rhythmic shocks that had kept our ruinous Rioge quivering. It piped and whistled as it worked. So far as I could see, the thing was without a directing Martian at all. The continuation follows in the third part of the book.